Hello, welcome listeners to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. This is the first episode we're recording in 2026. Thanks for listening. My guest on today's podcast, joining us from his home in Halifax, Massachusetts via Zoom, is my friend Gordon Laws. Welcome to the podcast, Gordon.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
We have talked about Dave and Kimmy Martin and their son Levi, who died by suicide. In prior podcasts, episode 631, Dave and Kimmy, is that how I pronounce her name, Gordon?
Kimi. It's kind of like you say kiwi, but with an M.
She's told me that before, and I always miss that. So thank you for keeping her name correct. Levi died in December of 2022, a transgender youth, and it just deeply moved me and our listeners, and I felt impressed to continue to talk about Levi when I talk about supporting LGBTQ people and reference him and his story and what we can do better. And one of the people that came through that I became aware of during that time of Levi's passing was Gordon Laws. And I believe he helped write the obituary and delivered the eulogy and is connected with the Martin family through common roots in the LDS Church. And I just thought, here's Gordon that seems to be a very close family friend that's very proximate to Levi and what was going on there, and wrote a wonderful eulogy. And I just felt impressed as part of this journey to keep Levi's story alive. Dave and Kimi are doing such a great job, but I thought I'd get Gordon on the podcast to share his thoughts about the Martin family, about Levi, anything else he wants to talk about, how to support LGBTQ people. Is that okay for an introduction, Gordon?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just modify one of the things
Please
that
do.
you stated is I did not deliver the eulogy. Dave delivered the eulogy at the funeral. I wrote probably 80 to 90% of it. I don't really like to claim authorship of it because it's not my story. It's Dave and Kimi's story, and I sat with them for several hours, asking a lot of questions and going through their family history and going through a lot of things that aren't included in the eulogy. And then I went home and wrote it up, and they had. I can't remember whether I volunteered or whether they asked me, but I wrote up the obituary and sent it to them, and then I wrote up kind of the longer version as I had felt to do, and Dave used that for the eulogy, and then that is what was ultimately published online for Lift and Love, and it's also, I think, some of the impetus of what moved the filmmakers of Sanctuary to include the Martins. But I emphasize again, it like I was. I did a role, but it's not my story.
That's great.
It is their story.
That's great. And I think one of your ministering skills is being in these really tender moments, helping people. I understand you've written a number of obituaries, or helped, maybe to your point, not written them, but help people get their thoughts out to you, and then you put it to words. What a wonderful service you've provided to the Martins and others. But yeah, and listeners, we will link to the Lift and Love site that has the eulogy. We'll talk about Sanctuary. Probably Gordon will bring that up, but we'll link to that wonderful documentary where the Martin story is part of that. But just keep sharing your story and your relationship with the Martin family and Levi, and what we can do better.
Sure. So I was a Sunday school and a young men's teacher, young men's advisor, and Sunday school teacher for probably 4 or 5 years. So I had each of the Martin's younger 3 kids as class members, and they were each just incredibly smart, incredibly curious, incredibly thoughtful about the doctrine of the church and that sort of thing. And it was they were also kind of part of a core of youth that were also incredibly thoughtful and incredibly um, questioning. I shouldn't. It's not questioning necessarily of their faith, but questioning of how doctrine applied and how and how it fit into challenges that they saw and things like that. So, um, it was a marvelous and wonderful challenge to teach such capable kids, and Levi in particular was really probing, really thoughtful, and very challenging of lots of things, lots of structure within the church, doctrine within the church, and lots of things socially and otherwise. He was incredibly well read, and we would exchange text messages periodically in which he would ask me questions like, well, if God is really like this, then why X? And they could be really really challenging questions for which I didn't necessarily have answers, and in which I'd have to be honest about what answers I had and what answers I didn't have. And so there was already kind of a relationship there. My kids had relationships with them. My daughter Lucia, my older daughter, was really good friends with Levi's um, the middle of the three younger, and then my younger daughter was really good friends with Levi on a personal level, and so there was a relationship that way and that sort of thing, and I had the experience obviously of teaching. As far as like my involvement in what happened in the aftermath and things like that. It was December 18th of the year that you said, and my wife was, I think, on the way back from UMass Amherst or some place like that, and I was home, and we had a little group chat between us and some other friends with the Martins, and Dave sent a message that Levi had passed away and had passed away by suicide.
Um,
And we knew that Levi had been struggling. He had not been able to go to school for quite some time. We had been over to dinner a number of times, and he would often not come out to say hi. He was struggling socially and struggling emotionally and struggling academically and things like that. So we were aware that there were struggles, and I can't say in some ways that it was a surprise exactly. Kimi, I think, described uh, the process of Levi's adolescence as watching him die, and that it was the culmination. And but when I got the message, I just messaged my wife or called her and said this is what had happened, and some of our other friends were out of town, and so I just drove to their house. Now, I honestly did not understand how immediate it was that Dave sent that message. For whatever reason, I had the impression that this is something that happened maybe the day before or something like that, and he was just now getting around to letting us know. Um, so I rolled up to their house, and I was actually there like before the police arrived,
wow.
and I rang their door, and Dave was really surprised to see me, and he threw his arms around me and he wept, and I came in with them, and then the police rolled up almost the exact same time as I did, and came in to give statements, or came in to get statements and to observe the scene, and that sort of thing. And so I sat with them through the course of the interviews with the police and the brief investigation and the calling out of the medical examiner and the removal of Levi's body and so on and so forth. There were moments in the police investigation where they, Dave and Kimi, were not sure of certain details that for whatever reason I knew and was able to contribute and that sort of thing. Um, and I wound up being there for hours. My wife and my older daughter wound up meeting me. Garrett, the oldest of the three younger sons, came over. I think Charlie reached as well, and so we wound up there with a number of family members, um, and we were just kind of together. And I can't say that I don't think I said a whole lot of anything, and I don't think that there is a lot to say in those types of circumstances. I think it was probably the next day that I went back. I believe I offered assistance in helping with the obituary and that sort of thing, and so we just spent a couple of hours talking through Levi's experience and Levi's life, and that's all detailed that you can see in the eulogy. And so I wound up writing two versions, and I wrote the shorter version as the obituary, and I wrote the longer version as the eulogy. And Dave adopted that and added some finer points and added the quote about Wicked and some other things like that. So obviously, one of the other things that I did is having served as a bishop before, and having presided over a number of funerals and that sort of thing, and knowing that the passing of a loved one will bring out a lot of attention. The passing of a loved one who's very young and where the passing was sudden will bring out even more attention. And it is almost always really well meaning, but it can be incredibly overwhelming. And so I volunteered to be the Martin's point person, and that is that any efforts that the Relief Society or the stake or the ward wanted to put in reference to doing meals or making other arrangements for the family, or um, helping to watch the dog and walk the dog and other things like that, to just run all of it through me. And I would distill everything down into something really easy for them, to where they wouldn't have to talk to quite so many people or have the phone ringing constantly, um, with tactical things that would be difficult to kind of get their arms around. And so I know that they were really appreciative of that. And I know that probably the thing that was most that you know Dave was most appreciative of, and he asked me about this probably a year later or something, and he said, "How did you know to come over?" And and I mean, I would love to tell you that it was like a big impression or something. It's not. I knew to go over because, having served in various of these capacities, I have learned the importance of just showing up and being there. That somebody gets in a car accident and you go to the hospital. Somebody is very sick and in the hospital, you go to the hospital. Somebody dies and you're close to them, you see the family. Um, and you just go there. Um, So that's what I did. I just went. And, I figured if it was a situation where it was overwhelming or I wasn't needed or whatever, then, I could calmly and casually just, in a low key way, back away. Um, but otherwise, it's really good to be there. And um, so that's essentially how it developed.
Thanks for sharing. It's really tender, listeners, to just be taken into kind of the worst parent nightmare, and you're sharing that as a friend of what was going on there. I love your intuition to minister and the principles you're sharing with all of us about how to be present for people. And I think my next reaction, Gordon, is to pull away and think people want their space and want their time, and I don't want to bother them. But the older I get and the more I walk into the same kind of spaces you're talking about, the more I recognize that people really care that you show up. And that hug he gave you on the doorstep when he saw you, and just you being there in his kind of worst nightmares, really painful, but really beautiful. And then your willingness to be present in that situation and find ways to help and minister and be the point person. So thank you for that. Thank you for just these principles that scale to all of us as we're trying to better support people. Just keep sharing whatever you'd like to share. I could ask you questions, but my impression is just to have you share.
Sure. So I think one of the things that is really critical about the experience is it is really useful to be there. What is not useful is to talk and to try to solve the problem. Um, and I'm certainly aware of various cases, especially when it comes to LGBTQ uh, youth or adults who have died prematurely, whether it's through just accidents or whether it's through suicide or drug overdoses or other things like that. There's this impulse to go in and to try to rectify doctrine or to explain the church position or to offer you know perspectives on the plan of salvation or whatever the case might be. And the reality is that uh, generally speaking, the people who are involved have researched all of that to the nth. They are deeply versed in it. They are um, already wrestling with and struggling with the challenges associated with it and the things that are not congruent. And you're not going to solve it. And it is not useful for you to try to solve it. It is much, much better to be present and to express love and to express empathy and to find ways that you can be of service. Um, One of the things that uh, people will say to each other all the time, and they mean it. They're good-hearted about this. They mean it. They'll say, "Let me know if there is anything I can do." And usually, the experience they're going through is so overwhelming that the people are not going to break that down easily. They're not going to be able to say what it is that they can do. So I'll give you a good example of a ward who really did this well very recently. My brother's wife was killed in a plane crash on October of this year,
Wow.
and I got there within 24 hours of that happening. By the time I had gotten there, I walked in, and there were some members of the ward taking measurements of the stovetop, the range. And that's because the stovetop had broken recently, and it needed to be replaced. And the ward members decided they were replacing it, and nobody asked permission. Nobody asked. I mean, obviously they said we're going to do this and so forth, but it's not something that my brother said, "Gosh, we could really use a new stovetop." They just decided to do it. And there are a number of things like that. The ward um, picks his kids up for seminary and has brought the kids to Halloween activities and and other things like that. And they just do things based on what they observe are gaps and needs. And that's the sort of thing that is really, really helpful. The the thing that I think cannot be emphasized enough is the ability to be present and to be still in the midst of um, real suffering and discomfort. And, you know, um, we have an impulse, I think it's kind of a people impulse anyway, to just want to make things better. And it's further exacerbated by being members of the church where we're constantly told to open our mouths and to testify boldly and not be ashamed of the gospel and other things like that. And so we have an impulse to, number one, try to solve problems. Number two, try to, bring the plan of salvation. We've been told forever that the answers to all our problems are in the scriptures, are in the gospel, and things like that. And so we're going to solve. I'll help you solve this problem. And the reality is that um, some of these tragedies are so deep and so wide that the the words that you are going to offer are they don't help, and if anything they might salt the wounds further, and they might create offense where you maybe don't mean offense. And um you know the best thing that you can do is kind of the mantra of what you state as the podcast mantra: listen, learn, and love. To just be patient and to listen and ask questions and explore, within the confines of kind of what's okay and what the person can tolerate talking about, and express love and empathy. And I'm not real inclined to go much further than that. I one of the stories from General Conference that always stuck with me, and I think it might have been Henry B. Eyring who told it. I could be wrong, but he talked about his father being hospitalized with a very serious illness, and he talked about um, visiting his father, I think, and it was might have been Spencer W. Kimball, it might have been Gordon B. Hinckley, it might have been or it might have been just one of the apostles, but the who didn't matter that much. What struck me was Elder Irene, if I even have that correct, said, I was with my dad, and one of the brethren walked in to see him, and I was really kind of excited because I thought, here is a moment where I will get to see one of the great ministers of the gospel minister to my father, and to know what to say and to know what words of comfort to express and things like that. And he said, and this person sat down and he shook my dad's hand and he said, "Hi, Hal." And my dad said hello back, and then they just looked at each other. And this person sat there and just sat with him for, it might have been 5 minutes, might have been 10 minutes or something like that. And then he said more or less, "Well, I hope you get on to getting better, and I love you, and we miss you." And then he left. And Elder Iron said, "I just thought, man, did I miss something? What happened?" Um, and it took a lot of reflection for him to realize the power of showing up, being present, expressing love, and not trying to solve, and not trying to solve that which, at least to our moral comprehension, is unsolvable.
Super helpful, Gordon. I've picked up from other guests some of the things you're sharing about the word impulse and trying to make things right. And sometimes I would be guilty of sharing a platitude. I might have even said 10 years ago, well, Levi's in a better place, or dismiss, and that would just dismiss the complexity of that and invalidate their pain. For me to say something like that, pointing to the plan of salvation and saying everything will be fine one day. And I think that is good. We have a feeling about the plan of salvation, but I agree that sometimes that causes us not to sit with people in their pain and allow people to grieve. I think culturally, sometimes we have created a culture where faithful Latter-day Saints don't grieve. They grieve for a period of time, but because they believe so strongly in the plan of salvation, they're able to move on. And I think grief is just so individual and so unique. And I think we need to create a culture that people can grieve and grieve for a lifetime, and even with hope in the future. And so thank you for all of that. and there may be more you want to share on that. I'd like to talk about Levi's obituary a little bit. I read that for the first time, and it's probably the most heartbreaking and complex and beautiful obituary I've ever written. And it's framed up with this picture of Levi. The first time I saw a picture of Levi is the picture that was chosen to be in the obituary. Just this beautiful young man. And I love hearing more about how bright he is, articulate, how thoughtful, the questions he asked. I love that you, as a trusted adult, he was comfortable asking you all these questions. And I love that at times you didn't know the answers, but you were just a safe place for him. But, I've read this before that he was intersex. Levi's gender was intersex caused by Swyer syndrome, meaning that it presented at female's birth, although he was genetically male. So that was really interesting to read that. This quote again, that this resultant condition and resultant gender dysphoria came with a host of medical and mental issues. And so that was just, really complex. His quote again, his final message to us was full of grace, love, and forgiveness, as well as an expression of the vast difficulties faced. And he signed his name Levi, which we deliberately use in his honor and ask that you do the same. And that was just so powerful to read parents' support of their son, their transgender son. In this case, there was a medical understanding, Swyer syndrome, of why Levi was walking such a complicated road. Then, as I'm sure you've read, Gordon, the Martins gave me a copy of Levi's suicide note. And this podcast, listeners, is all framed in a trigger warning. I'll put that on the introduction. We are obviously talking about suicide, and please call, text, reach out to 988 if you're feeling suicidal. But there's 4 phrases I highlighted from Levi's suicide note. I am so sorry. I love you all so much. Then in the body, he goes on to say, I am terrified how society treats transgender people. Then I read, I hate when people blame suicides on music, games, and the TV. This is not the fault of any of you. I'm excited to finally be free. I've never read a note like that, Gordon. It's the first time I've ever read a note like that and taken in that sacred, painful space where Levi was and sharing his feelings. This thought about I'm terrified of how society treats transgender people just breaks my heart. This was 3 years ago, last December, as we've talked about, but it seems like in society it's just become worse, and we've created a whole new bogeyman in society and fear around trans people. And Levi was feeling a lot of that 3 years ago, and that seems to me has only gotten worse, and that's heartbreaking to me. But listeners, just some thoughts as I've processed this, and I'd love to, get Gordon continue to talk about anything I've said or anything you'd just like to say.
Yeah. So one of the things that I have thought about the reception of the eulogy is it went viral, so to speak. I mean, it got viewed like 100,000 times within, I don't know, 2 weeks or something like that, and it really
Good.
and it really moved a lot of people. It moved a lot of people who would theoretically be opposed to trans rights and things like that. It moved a lot of people, who obviously know and things like that. But it moved a lot of people in a lot of places. The world has gotten worse since that time, and and one of the things that I think about the eulogy is because it gave so much context about Levi. It created it made sort of like the safe trans person. And what I mean by that is that it depicts, so to speak, somebody who, in most people's minds, could say definitely did not choose this. Anatomically, Levi was born with female genitalia and had ovaries, which turned out to be stunted in their growth and cancerous and had to be removed. Um, but also definitively had XY chromosomes. And uh, if Levi's body had been consumed in a fire and had to be identified, would have been identified as male. And there's no getting around those two biological facts. And the church itself, in its handbook of instructions, while saying, having the church having released statements that um, gender aligns with your that eternal gender aligns with your biological sex at birth. The church has one paragraph in the handbook of instructions that indicates that there are uh, very rare occasions in which a person is born with either mixed genitalia or intersex conditions. And in such cases, the gender dysphoria and other things like that might persist, and that people should be incredibly kind and understanding, and that questions about the priesthood and other things like that should be referred to this first presidency. So Levi in presentation, so to speak, and in the eulogy, kind of fits those criteria. And so it becomes like a safe person or a safe story for people to say, wow, that's so tragic. And the church, says what it says about it, and this kind of thing can happen, and so forth. And yet, such people can still kind of resolve their cognitive dissonance of other trans people by suggesting or saying, well, you're caught up in a fad, or you have been affected by social contagion, or whatever the case might be. And there are a lot of problems with that line of thinking. First of all, in Levi's case, Dave and Kimi and Levi himself did not know about Swire syndrome until after Levi had said that he thought he was trans, and until after they had been through years of suffering that of this tension and this disconnect of um, you know having female parts and appearance, but not developing hormonally and otherwise in a way congruent with a traditional female. And that there were suggestions of there were prescriptions of hormone therapy, and there were meetings after meetings after meetings with doctors, and there were problems with suicidal ideation, and there were hospitalizations, and there were inpatient treatment facilities and things like that. And so Dave and Kimi and Levi did not labor with this challenge with this like knowledge of, I'm the safe condition, so to speak. I'm the acceptable condition that the church and others say, sometimes this happens, and it's complicated, and so be nice about it. And um, and were they not involved with Boston Children's Hospital, which has gender affirming care, which is under assault right now
Yeah.
across the nation, and is, there are very serious threats to ban gender affirming care. um, they never would have learned that. They learned it because of genetic testing, and genetic testing that Boston Children's is one of the few places willing to do, and that is has enough capital and political well-being and things like that to be able to do. And so you easily could have had a situation where Levi could have passed, and people would not feel, quote unquote, safe, so to speak, in in looking at this case. And what that also opens the possibility to is that there is so much that we don't know about genetics. There is so much that we don't know about biology. There is so much that we don't know about even basic functions of the natural world and that sort of thing, that it really, really behooves us to be still, to be patient, to be loving, to not judge, um, and to meet people where they are, and to bear with them in the stories and in the challenges that they encounter. Um, there are plenty of people who are transgender who don't have Swyer syndrome. That does not mean that there is not some kind of biological and or genetic component. Um, there are cases where this has probably not been discovered, what the underlying issues are. That doesn't mean they're not there. And I just don't see I don't see the savior uh, looking at these individuals um, as you know massive threats to the family and to society and to things like that have been really sort of trumped up in popular media. I think plenty of examples exist within Scripture in which the Lord performs miracles for and in behalf of people that are suffering from what we would now recognize as severe biological issues, um, severe psychological issues, severe emotional issues, um, and that he meets them where they are in terminology that fits for them and that they can understand. And he heals or succors or helps them um, in ways um, that are befitting of the circumstance, and that it behooves all of us to do the same and to be kind and to listen and to be patient and to hear out people's stories. So if there's anything that I regret about the eulogy, it's the fact that it is a complex eulogy for a complex life, and it is a true eulogy. It is true. The everything therein is true. Um, if there's anything I regret about it, it is the possibility that it gives people an easy way out to feel that, okay, his situation is quote unquote acceptable, whereas these other situations are not. And in reality, um, we probably just don't understand the underlying mechanics of the biological diversity that is manifest in our Heavenly Father's children.
That's a beautiful segment, Gordon. Um, just moved by that. It's just how I feel. And I wrote down a few things is, don't let loud political voices or other voices inform you about trans people. Let trans people inform you about trans people, and lots of them. I call it the trap of unearned opinions. It's easy for me to have opinions about trans people by watching what I see on TV or the radio. It's better and maybe more like the Savior would invite us to do to get to know trans people. I think when you pivot to Christ and his ministry, I think that's beautiful. And I thought of a woman with an issue of blood and how she was deemed unworthy. And Christ, obviously felt different about her. And now we understand the science about a woman with an issue of blood. And of course, she's worthy and clean. And sometimes, listeners, this, I talk about Catherine Schweitzer who ran the Boston Marathon. This isn't a trans story, but it teaches a principle in 1964 ish. And the assumption that day is women were too frail to run marathons. So she's number 261. There's a picture of the race officials trying to have her leave the course. And then 50 years later, with the same number, she runs the Boston Marathon again. And what's changed? It's the things Gordon's telling us is in the mid 60s, we didn't have the science that helped us understand women are not too frail to run marathons. Of course, they can run marathons. And what's others changed? We have proximity. All of us know women that run marathons. And so I think of what you're inviting us to feel and learn about trans people is to be open to learning, and science is our friend. But I love what you're talking about is the safe trans story versus the one that doesn't have a scientific um, understanding yet, and give the same love and grace that we do to Levi and people with Sawyer syndrome as we do to other people with gender dysphoria. And to drown out the loud voices, so much of the world is based on fear of other people to accomplish a goal. And I just think Christ never did that in his ministry. He never created fear to get followers. I don't think he was actually trying to get followers. I think that just happened naturally when people saw how he loved and supported everybody, especially those furthest on the margins that he made feel welcome. So I think it's better to follow the example of Christ and loving everybody than a fear-based narrative that it can generate community and donations and everything, but there's a cost to that. And the cost in this case is trans people. And I'm heartbroken, Gordon, for how it's this toughest space for me of all the issues in my heart. How we treat trans people is the top of the list. And it's just heartbreaking for me. And maybe that's one of the reasons I want to have you on the podcast, because you have really thoughtful insights into this space. Keep sharing. I know you've got a hard stop, I think, in about 5 or 10 minutes, but keep sharing anything else you want to share.
Um, I I I wish that people would give space to the breadth and the width of our theology. Um, and I mean, it is like section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants um, says and it notes the sons of perdition, but it as being exceptions, which you'd have to do monumental things to be a son of perdition. So it really is not applicable to anybody listening and so forth. But it says, wherefore he saves all the works of his hands. And yes, I'm familiar with the kingdoms and the breakdowns and the way that we tease out these distinctions and falling short and this and that and things like that. But the scriptures are extremely clear that um, we will wind up in places that we want to be and that we feel happiest in, and that is, you know, that we would be most at peace at, and that is an incredible grace. And we have so much fear of winding up in a bad place or a lesser place or something like that, that it drives us to be um, controlling and unkind, and to actually go counter to um, our scripture. And I wish that we would embrace how much grace the Lord operates with. Um, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, and um, the idea that the Lord would save with the highest reward the person who showed up to labor in the 11th hour in the same way as the person who showed up to labor in the first hour. People do not appreciate the depth of that story nearly enough. And so we have people who mourn over teachings and doctrine that I think are not really necessarily so. We have people, who have lost LGBTQ children and who believe that they are lost forever. We have people who kick out of houses and refuse to speak to again um, their LGBTQ relatives. They feel justified in that because of things that um, our church leadership has said at times. And um, and to which I say the scriptures are abundantly clear that judgment is committed to the Son, that grace is sufficient for all of us, and it is fundamentally impossible for us to know what anybody's outcome would be. And that there is virtually never a time where there would not be hope for your loved one. And that your cruelty is not serving that person at all. So, and that's setting aside the debate over whether the church's stance is correct on anything. And I'm trying to kind of suggest and meet people where they are. Um, but I we take a much too limited view of the grace of Jesus Christ when we look at um, decisions that people make and categorize in our minds what kingdom we think they're going to wind up in, and then act or mourn accordingly. And I don't think the Lord could be clearer on how far we get that wrong when he says that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. It would not surprise me to see a ton of LGBTQ people go into the kingdom well ahead of the traditional temple married people. Because I believe what the Lord says, the first shall be last and the last shall be first.
I love that. Thank you, Gordon Loves. I'm so glad I've had this impression for a while to reach out to you, and what you've said has been just so helpful, and your understanding the scriptures equally is helpful. Dave and Kimi, if you're listening, the more I learn about like what Gordon has talked about and your love for Levi and all the work you did, and I reread the last words of Levi's note, this is not the fault of any of you, and I love you, and you are done such a great job, and I just mourn that Levi's gone, and I love that you continue to keep his memory alive with all that you do, including me on the movie Sanctuary. In the show notes, we'll link to the Lift and Love eulogy that Gordon referenced. We'll link to the movie Sanctuary. It's terrific. I'm thinking of Evan Smith and Cheryl, great allies. I think there was a showing of that in the Boston area, and there's other showings, and we'll link to Sanctuary. Please watch that movie. We'll link to Levi's obituary. We'll link to episode 631, where Dave and Kimi came on the podcast and talked more. And Gordon and I just invite us all to do what we can to better love people. LGBTQ is obviously the focus of this episode in the podcast, but take the principles that Gordon has shared and just use those to better love and support people. And so this is Gordon Laws and Richard Ostler signing off on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.